Christianity has a hell problem. There is so much beauty and truth in Christianity. The Golden Rule is a brilliant piece of moral wisdom. The Beatitudes are a revolutionary way of looking at the world. Jesus' nonviolent path of enemy love inspired beacons of justice like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. And yet, no matter how much good you can find in it, at the end of the day, there is a big black hole right at the center. The belief that everyone who doesn't follow the right faith is going to hell to suffer for eternity. Hey, welcome to Workers Lit, a bonus episode. We've got an interview here, and I'm really excited to be joined by Brian Recker. He's a public theologian and an author of best-selling book, Hellbent, which we're here to talk about. Brian, welcome to the show.
What's up, Jacob? Thanks for having me, bro.
Yeah, did I get your bio good there? Is there anything you want to add to that?
I'm an ex-pastor. Most of the things that I am are things that I used to be. So I don't know. Those don't
Yeah,
in bios. I used to be a Marine. I used to be a pastor. I'm a
yeah,
father of four.
heck yeah.
So, there's various items we could expand upon, but
There's something poetic about that. Most everything I am is something I used to be. That
well, they don't let me quit. Actually, sometimes I'll say, "Oh, I used to be a Marine," and people are like, "Once a Marine, always a Marine." And I'm like, I don't know. It doesn't really
yeah,
define me anymore. And I'll say I used to be a
hoorah.
pastor, and people are like, "You're still a pastor." I'm like, "Come on, man! Like, let me quit. I want to be done."
Yeah, yeah, just when they think when you think you're out, they pull you back in.
Right.
Right at the top, I'm gonna say this is a great book for folks, especially folks that are former evangelical or they're connected to the community somehow, or just interested in another perspective on Christianity than maybe what you're raised with in United States and elsewhere. I highly recommend it. It's going to be linked in the show notes below. So right at the top, I just want to throw that out there. I just read it. I just blew through it in a couple of days and really appreciated it myself. And I know a lot of folks listening are interested in that kind of stuff because we have covered some really fun stuff on the show from a different perspective on evangelical Christianity. We covered Left Behind. We've covered Every Young Man's Battle, Compassionate Capitalism by the DeVos billionaire, all kinds of fun stuff.
Oh,
So,
interesting.
oh
Which
yeah,
did you determine that capitalism could in fact be compassionate, or did we
no,
rule that out?
he makes a lot of really interesting predictions about how much like better life's gonna get in the early 90s. And like, because like now, I don't know, he's got some declaration that we've defeated the bad guys and we're just gonna enter an era of pure George W. Bush thought forever. And
Man,
that one didn't
this
happen.
doesn't feel like it's panning out like that. I don't know.
No, not how he hoped to, but he died with billions of dollars anyway, so I'm sure he felt okay. Well, this book is great. This is a book fundamentally about hell and you wrestling with it and you wrestling with what you find to be the problem of hell at the center of evangelical Christianity. So you talk about your journey from that, from evangelical pastors' kids to pastor yourself. You talk about going to Bob Jones University in this book. Could you tell listeners about this, your journey, why you were moved to write this book? The Bob Jones thing jumped out at me because I went to Christian school my whole life and we used textbooks published by
Oh
Bob Jones.
no.
So I was like right there with you.
Yeah, that's anybody who has that in their background, hopefully is in therapy at some level now. You do have religious trauma, even if you're not aware of it,
Oh, yeah.
if Bob Jones is in your history at any level. Yeah, so I grew up in fundamentalism, actually. My dad is an independent fundamental Baptist pastor,
Okay.
so fire and brimstone sermons were pretty forefront. I had that common experience of kids growing up in that world of just getting saved over and over and over again out of really a fear of my eternal salvation and where I was going to go when I died, because in that framework, you're told that everybody deserves to go to hell. Even kids are born worthy of hell, and you have to get saved in order to kind of put yourself in this other category of safe and heaven bound. And the stakes are just so high that you're never quite sure if you've made it or not. And so it kind of puts you in a spiritual state of anxiety. And so for a lot of us, our formative spiritual memories are based in kind of wrestling with whether or not I'm saved. And all of that was having to do not with what kind of people we're becoming, whether or not we're experiencing a sense of connection to ourselves and to the divine in this world, but really about whether or not we were safe or whether we're going to be punished by God in the afterlife. And that is a problem for a lot of reasons. And the reason I wrote my book is that in many ways, this anxiety robs us of an authentic spirituality. And so while Christians we talk a lot about a relationship with God. That's actually a very toxic relationship that we had with the divine, one based in anxiety and exclusionary beliefs, and but kind of being on the right side of this punishment line as opposed to focusing on connection. And we can see that having ripple effects in all kinds of things in evangelical spirituality, to include how they do political engagement. But my book is about hell, but it really is. I mean, if you've not thought that much about hell, I think that it is broader than that, in the sense it talks about the way that dogma and exclusionary thinking and binary thinking, this requirement of having insiders and outsiders in our spirituality, how that really has shaped American evangelicalism. Our whole country is shaped by this.
Yeah, 100%. We primarily are sort of a political show. What you nail on here that's very interesting is something that we had a former guest almost 2 years ago now when he came on, Vijay Prashad, talked about how he found the story of Christ to be like a very liberatory story. You know, he's talking from the Indian perspective of thinking about like literally like a peasant class fighting back against an empire, really. You have a quote in here that says, if we fail to acknowledge the political connotation of Jesus' death, then we hamstring his message. The dream that Jesus lived for was the dream that Jesus died for. Jesus died for the world to be transformed. It's a really powerful concept because when you put hell at the center of your ideology or your theology, or even when you're not centering it in the sense of like, we're talking about it all the time, if it's there like a black hole in the middle of everything, then it makes those liberatory possibilities impossible. So I guess what I was going to say next is, so since our show is kind of primarily a political one in a lot of ways, and you establish hell, it takes revolutionary, liberatory capacity out of Christianity, and it also is a political tool for oppression. I'd love if you could speak to that some more.
Yeah, I mean, this hell is so all encompassing that I say in the book that it sucks the air out of the room for a vision of a positive spirituality. It makes your spirituality primarily about avoiding punishment in the afterlife. And so, if something like that is a part of the story at any level, you're always going to have a hard time centering justice in this world, because the stakes are so high that really it becomes the primary purpose of this life is to make sure that you don't go to hell, is to make sure that you go to heaven and not hell. And that becomes the main goal of spirituality and really the purpose of life in general. And so it robs you of meaningful liberatory engagement in this world, because that becomes the focus of the gospel. And so Jesus's death is a good example. The quote that you mentioned was about like the death of Jesus. One of the common questions I'll get from people when I say I don't believe hell is a real place, I believe it's a spiritual metaphor. And people will say, well, if there's no hell, why did Jesus die? What was the point of Jesus if there's no hell? Because for most people, Jesus is this get out of hell free card. The point of Jesus is to be a savior from what? A savior from hell. And what that basically means is he accomplished this metaphysical substitution so that you can engage in a transaction with God, and Jesus is punished in your place so you don't have to be punished. And there's a lot of problems with this, but one of the main problems is it puts all the emphasis on Jesus's death as a transaction, and it takes all the emphasis off of Jesus's life. In this framework, Jesus didn't even need to have a life. He just needed to have a death. He just needed to die as a sacrifice for our sins. And it misses the whole point of, well, what did Jesus care about? What did he live for? What was his actual message? Because when Jesus described his purpose, he didn't say my purpose is to come as a sacrifice for sin so that, I'm punished in your place so you can go to heaven when you die. Jesus said his purpose was to preach good news to the poor, liberation to the oppressed, and to declare the Jubilee year, which was a year of economic redistribution, cancellation of debt, the freedom of slaves, and to start this new community called the Kingdom of God, which was about God's dream for the world, not for the afterlife, but for this life. And when I talk about the death of Jesus, my starting point is Jesus died for what he lived for. And what he lived for was this worldly message of liberation for the oppressed. We have made the Bible about the afterlife rather than this life, but the Bible is a messy book with dirt under its fingernails. The people of the Bible care about the same things that we care about: economic instability, food scarcity, indebtedness, war. These are the things that kept them up at night, the same things that keep us up at night. And a lot of times things in the Bible that sound like they're about the afterlife are just using apocalyptic hyperbole, sort of spiritually charged language, to speak of the cataclysms we face in this life. Because when you're going through, I don't know, for instance, your hometown being bombarded and all of the buildings being leveled, using apocalyptic, hellish type language to describe a genocide makes perfect sense. Because a lot of times the language in the Bible, it sounds like the world is ending, because the world was ending for them.
Right.
And so that language makes perfect sense. But when we read that and we think, oh, this is about the future and the world ending and apocalypse and Armageddon, and this is about the afterlife, we are missing the point that God cares about this life, the kinds of worlds we're creating. And I believe that Jesus came and lived and died to show us a new way to be human in this world. And that's what spirituality is ultimately about. And hell robs us of that liberatory message. It makes salvation all about salvation in the afterlife, to the point when a Christian hears the word salvation, they're thinking of heaven. They're not thinking of saving the people in this world. Like salvation to me, when I think of salvation, I think of the fact that we as a country have more children in poverty than any other wealthy nation.
Yeah.
Salvation would look like that changing.
So as a follow-up, how does this doctrine of hell and punishment reflect in our politics? Because one thing that I'm thinking of, you're talking about when you have this idea of saved and unsaved, elect versus unelect, the damned versus the not. You really can dehumanize people a lot. And I mean, the first place my mind goes is, old school colonialism and like, oh, conquistadors are getting this kind of mandate of heaven because, oh, well, at the end of the day, we save a few souls, then whatever we do here doesn't matter. But how does that reflect in our modern politics as well, you feel like?
Yeah, so I talk about exactly what you mentioned in the book a little bit,
Yeah.
how this logic of hell justified colonialism very explicitly. The doctrine of discovery, there was a papal edict that basically gave spiritual justification to the project of colonization, saying, hey, we have the truth about heaven and hell. Those pagan countries are going to hell. And therefore, in our conquest of those nations, even if some people die, listen, at this point, they're all going to die and go to hell anyway. So at least if we conquer them, even though there'll be some pillaging and some, maybe some light genocide and some deaths that occur, at the end of the day, they're going to get the message of the gospel. So they have the opportunity to go to heaven. And this logic still continues. I mean, just the other day, J.D. Vance said in like a Thanksgiving speech, he said something about how, woke liberals are trying to make it sound like the Pilgrim story and the Indian story is this bad thing. And we need to take it back because the reality is American or European Christians came and we made this country better because they were doing child sacrifices here, et cetera, et cetera. Basically just stereotyping indigenous spirituality as this harmful, bad thing. And Christianity brought the good. And I mean, that's just off base for a lot of different reasons. But you're right that this idea, when you believe that you have the keys to heaven and hell, when you believe that your side has the truth about who's going where in the afterlife, you can justify just about anything. And that does affect your posture towards the world. And so right now, I mean, we are seeing this at pretty high levels that Christian nationalism, this marriage of American evangelicalism, conservative theology with sort of anti-immigrant white nationalist policies, and they're the perfect bedfellows because already you have ingrained in evangelicalism this binary thinking that there are insiders, there are outsiders, there's an us and there's a them, there are people who are going to heaven, there are people who are going to hell. And when you couple that with race and nationality, and even though it doesn't even make sense, because when you look at actually the immigrants that are coming in, even illegally, they are majority Christian,
Right,
right?
exactly.
So it doesn't actually make sense. But I mean, they will absolutely jump through hoops and say, well, these are Catholics, or they're not real Christians, or they're criminals, and therefore they're not acting Christian in that moment. But certainly, once you have a binary universe, and you believe that God is a punisher and God will exclude not just some people, but the majority of people for eternity. Because if you believe that only Christians are going to heaven, then you actually believe that over 2/3 of humanity are damned. So the majority of people that ever lived are going to suffer in this way.
That's only if you're counting all Christians, which I'll be real, most churches I attended as a child did not.
For sure, like, there's a lot there's, like, Christians with quotes, like, "Oh, you're, like,
Right,
a cultural Christian," or, "You're a
yeah.
Catholic," or, I mean, Baptists don't believe Pentecostals are in, Pentecostals don't believe Baptists are in. Everybody's world is so
Lukewarm, yeah.
small. If that's what God does, God picks winners and losers, then it's very easy to do that in our politics. You can see how, I spoke about universalism in a reel not too long ago, and somebody in the comments basically said, I mentioned something about illegal immigration, and they said, well, God has gates around heaven, and no illegal immigrants are going to get into heaven out of hell. And so in their mind, there is this sense that, yeah, excluding people is exactly the kind of thing that God does. It's the kind of thing that we can do too.
Yeah, I will say the ICE agents, I don't think are gonna protect, Lazarus, they're gonna protect the rich man, and I also think it's interesting, I mean, at the time of our recording, just last night, the US Department of Labor posted the Confederate flag the stars of the Confederate flag and said the fight for Western civilization has begun and Americanism will prevail. Like, but that's the kind of language we're using. So also like when we're talking about this colonialism and this old school horrible stuff, obviously we have fought to overcome a lot of that, but a lot of that is undergirding the stuff, and there are forces that want to bring it back. I mean, that's a post from the US Department of Labor that happened just a few hours ago. Time
That's
of this recording.
horrifying.
It's horrifying. And I think it's interesting you make the point that people who supported slavery and people who fought against slavery both were able to use the language of the Bible as
Yeah,
justification for that, because in a book like the Bible and a spirituality as rich and tradition as old as Christianity, you're going to find what you're looking for. And if you're looking for liberation, you are going to find it. And if you're looking for a reason to oppress other people, you're probably going to find it, which I would say was the case with almost any doctrine.
totally. And unfortunately, whenever especially you look at religions that gain a lot of cultural power, that become the majority religion, and that also get linked to empire, just as often as being a force of liberation, if not more frequently, religions are used to baptize empire's logic, to baptize slaveholder logic, to give sort of a spiritual justification to some of the worst impulses of humanity. I mean, religion and Christianity is being used that way right now and has been used that way throughout history. And so, for people who walk away from Christianity because of that, I think that's a good reason to leave. And I'm not trying to, I didn't write this book to say, well, you have to be a Christian or you should stay Christian, just reject hell. I think for many of us, though, we want to stubbornly hold on to Jesus because he's actually being misrepresented. And so while you can use religion to punish people and exclude people, that was not what Jesus did. And so I still call myself a Christian because I think Jesus is too good to be owned by the people with the worst opinions in this country. And I don't think that they're accurately reflecting his spirituality, which was very universalistic in its approach and quite radical and inclusive. Um, and so I don't know. I think that's why I'm on about that. But I hope nobody hears that as like a, well, you're supposed to be Christian. One of the nice things about deconstructing hell is you can get rid of those supposed tos. I see Christianity as a spirituality, a pathway into love. And it's not the only one. There's other ways for us to get towards love and collective liberation. But that is the end goal. And I believe that's what Jesus was pushing towards.
Honestly, you just nailed what my next question was gonna be, so I can just jump over that. I was gonna ask, a lot of us feel confusion about where we come from, whether we wanna reclaim that culture or leave it behind.
I think what I'll just say
Yeah.
is this is a personal journey and there's no right answer. And for me, it's been empowering to reclaim it and to say, you don't get to have the last word on who God is. Many of us met God under threat of hell. The very concept of God is spoiled by the fact that when we learned about God, we learned about the consequence for not being in a relationship with God. So it
Right.
was, here's, you love God or else. And that is no way to meet any relationship, much less God. You can't enter into a loving relationship under threat of coercion. And so for a lot of us, we've discarded the idea of God because God has always been a punishing authoritarian. And so for me, reclaiming the very concept of God has been also redefining that concept. I see God as a universal spirit of love, not as a punishing authoritarian. And yeah, I just think some of these concepts are worth reclaiming, but that's an empowering act. And if it feels more empowering for you to say, I don't need to call myself a Christian, I don't need God or Jesus in my life to pursue love and collective liberation, I think that's okay too. You can make that choice. You can also change your mind in the future if you want to pick something back up.
I mean, you make the great point about, who Jesus says the centurion has better faith than anybody, the good Samaritan. These people are not necessarily in the faith, but they are acting these ideals out correctly, which is what, matters more.
It happens over and over again, and it's actually shocking how Christians have been unable to take that out of Jesus's message, that over and over again, he points out the faith of people who were not believers. They did not have the right theology. They didn't believe the right creeds or dogmas. They didn't have the right answers. And Jesus didn't go around and say, well, here's what you're supposed to be believing. He actually acknowledged their faith, and faith not in, again, a dogma, but faith in humanity, faith in compassion, faith in our interconnectedness, faith that we have more in common than we have separate, faith in our human solidarity. Those are the kinds of things that Jesus acknowledged in those people.
Absolutely. So, in a blunt question, how do we, those of us who are like you, still call themselves Christians, or those of us who are former Christians, or those of us who just want to build better towards a collective liberation, how do we push back against this overarching evangelical power structure? We had an episode on the Laven book, Wild Faith. It's tough to cut through the noise. Personally, I feel a great deal of empathy for people in the evangelical church. You make a great point here that people do feel like they are acting out of love, even when they seem to be and are acting out of hate. There's a weird contradiction that hell allows people to feel like they're doing something correct when they are really repressing people. It's something that if you haven't lived it yourself, it's hard to understand. I think you do your best to explain it in this book. It's something that spoke to me. And for those who haven't lived it, I recommend they read the book so you can kind of understand. How do we try to cut through this? I think books like this do that kind of work. But what would you recommend people do? I mean, I guess just trying to push back both against this power structure and on an individual level. Not asking you to have all the answers to
Yeah.
this massive
Well,
question,
it
but
looks different for everybody. If you're someone who considers yourself within the Christian tradition, I think a lot of us we fall in different places. Many of us have struggled to find faith communities that reflect our values. But I will say right now, I could see the church being more important than ever during a time where right now we need community organizing. I mean, right now the systems are failing us.
yeah,
Politically, we don't have any good parties. There's not good choices,
yeah,
right? So you can just say, "Oh, well, vote. You just got to vote. Vote blue, no matter who." Okay, I mean, sure, I'm gonna vote, but at the end of the day,
and
that
then
is
what?
not
Yeah,
probably we don't have great choices, right? But one thing we can do is organize collectively in our local communities, and that can be really hard. And churches, good progressive churches with a community mindset, can be a great place where that's happening. I just last week went to a meeting that trained observers to respond to ICE agent showing up, like because ICE is now in Raleigh, so that they've just recently arrived to my town,
yeah.
and so a church hosted a training for, hey, put yourself on a list. When we get a report of ICE being cited, you can be on this list to respond with your cell phone to, that we can respond with mobilizing people together to begin protesting and that sort of thing. And it was a church that put that on, a progressive church. And that was a great place to organize and to train and to now equip people to go out and protect their communities, to protect their neighbors. I'm not
Uh,
saying that that has to be churches doing that, but that's the kind of thing churches can be doing right now. And I want people to be encouraged that there are churches doing stuff like that. And beyond that, that's for this particular crisis. But I have a buddy who leads a church that they were canceling debt for people in their communities. And that is not going to change the world, just one community doing it, but it is a light. I mean, the Bible talks a little bit about us being salt and light. If we want to see the kind of world where medical debt is not a thing, where people aren't under crushing weights, then yeah, we first demonstrate that in our communities that we are building together. So churches can be hubs for community organizing, for mutual aid. And I would encourage you, if you haven't tried to find a church like that, if you consider yourself a Christian, if you long for spiritual community, most of us are pretty lonely right now. And so I would say that finding a progressive church, it's easier than you probably think. The Episcopal Church, the United Methodist Church, these are affirming progressive denominations. And so while the loudest Christians in the country right now are very conservative, talking about hell, talking about Charlie Kirk, et cetera, I think you should be encouraged that there are Christians doing good work right now as well.
Excellent. And I want to point out a couple of us on this podcast are from the Atlanta area. Here in Atlanta, we have the Atlanta Multi Faith Coalition, which 2 years ago was formed when the crisis in Gaza began. And it's mosques, synagogues, and churches that came together, and they have been doing great work. And since then, they're now doing work around Sudan. They're doing work around fighting back against ICE. Every month, they hold this multi faith walk for several miles, this pilgrimage walk, really, for people from all faiths that can walk together and pray and speak in solidarity. And they'll go to different sites. They'll go to Ebenezer Baptist Church, or they'll go to the middle of town. There's some really beautiful stuff that happens through that. And also through that ability to connect across faiths, which is super important because they also want to divide us along faith and racial lines. The ruling class would love nothing more than for Christians and Muslims not to speak, for Muslims and Jews not to speak, for, Hindus and Buddhists not to speak, and so on and so on.
It's so true.
Two more questions here. The first is, what do you want people that if you haven't covered already, what do you want people, regardless of background, to take away from this interview, this book, your ministry, and more broadly? Any other thoughts that you wanted to throw out there that I haven't asked you about?
I wrote this book primarily for people who have undergone a bit of a deconstruction process or who were in either evangelicalism or another strain of high control or fear-based Christianity. And there's many different versions of that where we received a similar kind of message where it was a love God or else. And for many of us, that shaped our very understanding of who God was and what spirituality is for. But for me, my ultimate hope is not just that people would replace their belief in hell with, a belief in universal salvation, although I do think that's a better way to look at things in a more hopeful way. um, but I think for me, it's not about replacing my former certainty about, I had this rigid black and white worldview where there were insiders, outsiders, there was heaven, there was hell, there was dogma, there was damnation. That rigidity, that certainty, I don't want to replace that with just a new set of better, more progressive answers and still be just as certain. I don't know what's going to happen when people die. When people ask me, well, what do you think is going to happen when people die? I hold quite a bit of agnosticism about that. For me, spirituality is about how I live my life. And the goal, I think, where I want people to land is not just they've taken apart some of their old beliefs and they have new, better beliefs that help them feel good about themselves. I think that spirituality invites us into interconnectedness, which the end goal of that is collective liberation. That as long as people are being left out and the forces of domination, I believe the story that the Bible is telling is not one about the afterlife. There are enemies, but those enemies are in this life and they're in charge. I grew up hearing about the worldliness. In fundamentalism, I grew up hearing about there's all this worldliness out there, all that bad stuff out there. We have this bubble of safety where we're following God. And it's funny how on the other side of deconstruction, I still see that in a sense, but that worldly system, that's capitalism. Like
Yeah.
these forces that are dominating us. And it's like, I didn't hear about that at all because it was all about the afterlife. It was about these satanic forces that just want us to not believe in Jesus, et cetera, et cetera. But there are forces that are shaping our desires, twisting our relationships, causing alienation, sowing disconnection into our relationships, separating us from each other, causing us to hate people who are different from us, of races, of religions, like you mentioned. And those forces are still to be resisted. And we need a spirituality that actually resists them. And so that to me is what spirituality is for. Not for me looking down on other people that are of a different faith than me, not for separating me as superior and saved, but actually for knitting us together and recognizing that we are all in this together and we have to fight for one another's liberation.
Absolutely. I was growing up kind of told the refrain was this world is not our home. And it's like, well, maybe it could be.
Is escapist. It's
Yeah.
primarily about getting the fuck out of here. It's either Jesus is gonna come back and take away all the redeemed and leave behind left behind the damned, or,
Kirk Cameron and the gang, yeah.
there's gonna be some big end times war. But either way, they think it's all gonna get wrapped up and it's gonna end. But actually, I think the work of spirituality is rolling up our sleeves and figuring out how to share this planet together and figure out how to be neighbors.
Absolutely. Well, the last thing I want to ask here, do you have a piece of evangelical media or something you grew up with that that's still a guilty pleasure, or something that you still like?
Oh, a guilty pleasure. Oh,
Yeah. For
interesting.
me, I'm gonna tell you, for me, and I'm not even guilty about it. I'm gonna still ride for Veggie Tales till the day I die,
Oh,
personally.
absolutely. I do love that, the bunny.
Yeah, gotta love it.
Oh, I love the bunny. Chick tracks I mentioned in my book that were
Yeah.
they're not a guilty pleasure necessarily. They're very bad. They're like these really fear-mongering gospel tracks, but I do find them funny now in
Oh yeah.
retrospect. They're like these little Satan men dragging people off to hell, et cetera, et cetera. And to be honest, I still love worship music.
Yeah.
I sometimes I'll get high and vibe to worship music.
Uh-huh.
You separate the artist from the art sometimes
Mhm.
with it. Um, that's not for everybody, but it brings me back to his particular headspace that can be very connected. And that's the point. Is like what brings you into that space of connection with God, yourself, and others. And that's just going to look different from everybody. So that just involves listening to yourself.
I think there's nothing wrong with a, little weed and a little Rich Mullins. I don't know. Well,
Sounds
thank you
pleasant.
so much, Brian. The book is Hellbent. People need to be checking it out. The link will be in the description of this. Folks, go get this book. Go recommend it to people. If it doesn't apply to you, at least know somebody who could benefit from this book. So definitely, please let
Yeah,
folks
I've
know
heard of a
about
lot
it.
of people getting it for their sort of fear-mongering relatives. Evangelicals are really good at gatekeeping information and saying, "Well, that's a bad book. That's a no-no book. I'm
Yeah,
not gonna read it." But I tried to write it in a way that would be invitational to everyone,
I agree.
and at
Yeah.
the very least, they can wrestle with it and agree to disagree. We'll see.
Yeah, you have a part in it where you describe every single time a pastor coming through asking every head bowed, every eyes closed, raise a hand, and I was like, "Oh, this guy knows ball. He knows his deal." I mean, evangelicals, they'll read that and they'll be like, "Okay, he knows what he's talking about at the very least."
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
Well, folks, go and support Brian's other work. Go follow him on social media. And once again, thank y'all for listening to another episode of Workers Lit. Brian, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Jacob.